Until next time, legends.
Transformers transforming bats in the sky. We won't stand for defeat.
Okay. Hello, it's DragonKeeper. Haven't done a movie review in a while, but I knew, like, even when I first heard of this movie and first saw the trailer, I knew I would probably end up doing a review for it because of the long history that I have with Transformers and watching and reviewing Transformers content. So I knew I had to see this opening weekend, and I knew a review would have to result. I'm gonna try as hard as I can to be normal about this movie, but I will fail, because this movie is everything I've ever wanted from a Transformers film. I'm not kidding. I've seen reviews, and, like, I don't know which review it was, but maybe it's just a consensus or Rotten Tomatoes that this is the best Transformers movie ever made. And yeah, they're pretty much all right. This is peak. I don't know if I would consider it peak Transformers fiction, but it's definitely peak what we've seen for a Transformers movie, and especially for a Transformers theatrical movie. I reviewed several of the movies on this channel. There were some that I hated, some that I fucking hated, and some that I liked, or that were technically bad, but I was willing to give a pass to because, you know, there was stuff in the movie that I liked, or I thought some of the ideas were interesting. Like, I think I was gentler on Age of Extinction than a lot of other reviewers were because there were things in it that I thought were cool. This movie blows all of those out of the water in terms of storytelling, action, character. It's not a perfect movie, but it sets the bar way higher than where these other movies did. I didn't realize this until, like, recently and tied into the marketing for this very movie, but this year is apparently the 40th anniversary of Transformers as a franchise. And between putting out this movie for their 40th anniversary and Disney putting out Wish for their 100-year anniversary, it's pretty clear which studio has put out the better movie. And the fact that it's not Disney, is pretty telling. Actually talking about, like, what this movie is about and why it's so good, it's kind of hard to know where to start. I'll start with basically the premise that the trailers let cue you in on. Is this is basically a prequel about how Megatron and Optimus Prime came to be the leaders of their respective factions, and basically how they went up from just another Cybertronian nobody to these great leaders that would be, you know, opposing each other in the Great War. So this movie is animated. It takes place entirely on Cybertron. 0 human characters. Whereas other prequel movies that we've seen have needed multiple films to tell a story, like the Star Wars prequel trilogy. It told its story in 3 movies when it probably only needed 1, maybe 2. Hobbit, of course, a lot of people have been, you know, griping about how that movie was 1 book that was stretched into 3 films. This, it feels pretty complete with just 1 movie. And the thing is, it's not complete, and it does leave the grounds open. It does leave the door open for a sequel. By the time the movie is ended, the war itself hasn't technically started yet, but it's, like, very clear that that's the direction it's heading. And even if this movie gets no sequels, it still kind of functions as a complete story, because even, like, someone who has a very cursory basic knowledge of Transformers can fill in the gaps themselves. But I really hope that doesn't happen. A big part of why I knew I had to make this review is apparently this movie isn't doing super well in theaters right now, and that is a tragedy. And if we don't get another sequel because this film doesn't make a profit in the box office, I will throw something. A short distance probably, but I will still throw it. Much like Elemental or Puss in Boots, I feel like this movie could make a profit if it's just allowed to be in the theater for long enough for, like, word of mouth to get around. I feel like this movie will end up being profitable, but it's not profitable right now, which is why it's as important as possible for as many Transformers films as possible to see it. I'll try to be kind of light on the spoilers, precisely because I do want you to see it, but because it is a prequel and because we already know the setup and we know where it's gonna end up, it's not, like, you kind of know where the movie is heading, and part of that is because the movie itself tells a very familiar story. The plot of this movie is very trope heavy. A lot of the beats and even the characters are things that we've seen in other movies. Optimus Prime and Megatron in their baby days, before they became the legends that they would later become, are named, as you may know from other continuities, Orion Pax for Optimus and D16 and Megatron, and the 2 of them are lowly miners working in the mines in Cybertron for Energon. Cybertron, which even though they do establish at the start of the movie, is still made from Primus's transformed body and is usually portrayed as 100% metallic, somehow still has earth that can be mined for energon. And not only like actual like ground and dirt, but like there's like plant life and like wild animals too. And the wild animals are also robotic, but that just raises more questions. So it's definitely a different Cybertron than we've seen. I understand the art style might be off-putting to some people. We're at an era where CG films are finally starting to like branch out and have distinct styles. This is not a style that we're used to seeing in films, especially not theatrical films. There are times where the designs of the characters do look kind of video game cutscene-ish, but not like a cheap video game, like an expensive modern like AAA game. But this movie does manage to be really visually interesting, like with the way Cybertron is portrayed and the fight scenes. Oh my god, the fight scenes. And one of the first shots in this movie is when we see the city of Cybertron, and normally we're kind of used to seeing Cybertron as this like darkly lit city, sort of like Coruscant from Star Wars, but at night. Just like skyscrapers as far as the eye could see. But when they zoom into the establishing shot of the city, or Icon City, where most of the movie takes place, we see that not only have skyscrapers coming up, but also skyscrapers coming down. Like, hanging down from a ceiling like stalactites. It's like, you have upside-down skyscrapers. Now it's different. This movie does a really good job with, like, the world building and establishing the setup. So basically, Orion Pax and D16, not Megatron yet, are mining Energon because they've been told that there was this war with the Quinazons, and that the planet used to just produce energon naturally. It would like flow through like channels already cut into the cities and stuff. But since there was this like devastating battle where the Quinazons basically wiped out the Primes and the matrix of leadership was lost. Nobody knows what happened to it, but they do know that since the Primes died and the Matrix disappeared, that the energon stopped flowing, so now it's gotta be mined. There's clearly a contrast between, Optimus, or Orion, I'm sorry, I'm still gotta refer to them by their old names, who is like this impulsive, like, troublemaker who's always, like, bending the rules and, like, very, like, very middle finger to authority, versus D16, who is much more like level-headed, always trying to reel in Orion, but getting dragged into his nonsense anyway. It's kind of weird that D16 is the follow the rules and keep your head down guy, where Orion Pax is the fuck you dad guy. But D16's turnaround from guy who follows the rules to terrifying warlord actually makes a lot of sense to me in this movie, but we'll get to that later. The point I was trying to make with these characters before I went off on this diatribe is that this dynamic of the wisecracking friend dragging around the responsible friend is very familiar, and that is far from the only familiar trope we see. Sentinel Prime is present. He's basically the leader of Cybertron. He is supposedly the last survivor of this war, last survivor of the Primes of this war with the Quinazons, and he is telling his people that he is searching for the matrix of leadership so that he can get the energon flowing again, and he is super popular on Cybertron, and he is very obviously the villain. like they do their best to hide it, but we know this story. We know he's going to turn out to be like the false idol. I would say it's not subtle, but the thing is, it is subtle. Like, there's nothing obviously villainous about him right away. It's just like, we kind of know where the story's going to shape up. At the very least, we know that due to this nature as a prequel, we know Sentinel's probably not going to get to the end of this movie alive. Saying that the movie is trope heavy might sound like a bad thing, like I might have said, but it isn't really. Just tropes are tools, and just because we've seen a story like this before doesn't mean that a familiar story can't be told well. In my opinion, this is a story that is told well. The dynamic between Orion Pax and D16 does kind of, I realized as I thought about the movie after I saw it kind of reminded me of another movie I really love, which is a movie I've talked about before on this channel, being Prince of Egypt.
Once I called you brother, once I thought the chance to make you laugh was all I ever wanted.
So in case you're not familiar with it, The Prince of Egypt is basically an animated adaptation of the book of Exodus from the Bible. And the movie kind of portrays that story as a personal tragedy between Moses and the Pharaoh, who they've named Ramesses. And that dynamic between Moses and Ramses early on in like the first act of the movie is very much the same as the dynamic between Orion Pax and D16 in this movie, with Moses, who eventually becomes the leader of the good guys, being like very irresponsible, very impulsive, like kind of like a college kid who means well but is always getting into trouble, and Ramses, who's the responsible one, who will be the leader of the villains after the time skips, kind of getting dragged along.
Ramesses, you're in trouble, young man.
Get down here! I think you owe us an apology!
Oh, my new thing!
It seems weird, but it also means that the hero has further to go in terms of development. These interactions are both weirder and made more interesting knowing that, like, the direction that these characters will take. Because if you, like, see these two characters interact without any outside context, it just seems like another, you know, irresponsible friend versus responsible friend dynamic. But knowing that these two become Optimus Prime and Megatron does kind of make it more interesting. Like, how are they going to go from this to that? And the movie does answer that pretty well. Not perfectly, but pretty well. The world building in this movie, like I said, is pretty solid. You see clearly at the beginning, like, the corrupt system that Cybertron is built on, but you also see, like, why the people would be complacent to it. The miners in this, who are so low that they can't even transform. Like, Transformer is, at the beginning of this movie, is a class designation. It doesn't apply to the whole species. And you notice early on, when you first see Orion Pax in the first scene, that he has a chest compartment that's visibly empty. And it turns out that it's because he doesn't have a T-cog. Which, if you remember from Transformers Prime, is the part that Transformers need to actually transform. T-cog is short for transformation cog. And it turns out none of the miners have their T-cogs. They're all, like, walking around working in the mines all day, operating with, like, these huge holes in their chests. And I remember seeing that early in the movie and thinking, so in this continuity, T-cogs aren't actually, like, organs that they're born with, like in Prime. That's a part that you're given. You know, the signs are there that the corruption is at place. Like, the miners work very hard jobs. They're being brutalized by their transformer overlords who lord over the fact that they can transform and you can't, loser. They, like, sleep in basically, like, lockers that are standing up against the wall, and just shown that their lives aren't really valued that much. There's a scene early on where when they're mining, the mine collapses because they don't have canaries to send into them. So they're all fleeing, and Jazz, falls behind, like a rock wall falls on him. So apparently the protocol in a situation like this is for them to just leave Jazz and get out. And Orion Pax ends up dragging D16 along to actually pulling Jazz out. And as a result, their supervisor, who is Elita 1, gets in a lot of trouble. Their lives aren't seen as valuable. But you also buy why they would be complacent with this system. Sentinel Prime, as obvious as he is to the viewer, does a good job. He feels like it's plausible to that the characters would believe that he's a real hero, even if the audience can see right through him. When the audience finally, like, gets to the reveal they're expecting, that Sentinel is actually a villain and he's done this terrible shit, even though you're kind of expecting that story beat, it is kind of shocking what exactly he did. Like, wow, I thought you were a bastard. I didn't think you were this much of a bastard. How Orion Pax and D16 figure this out is basically they end up pissing off one of their supervisors, who's a guy named Darkwing. He's a Transformer, and he ends up throwing them down a chute, and they fall, like, way down to the bottom strata of Cybertron, and they end up running into, well, he hasn't been named such yet, but it's very obviously Bumblebee. His name is just a string of numbers, like D16, but it starts with the letter B, so they just call him B throughout, and yeah, it's very obvious from, like, his character model who he ultimately is. B ends up accidentally leading them to a video recording of Alpha Trion, who's one of the 13 Primes, asking for help and giving them coordinates to where he is. The very obvious parallel to Star Wars comes immediately to mind. It was just like when they first found the message and started playing, I was half expecting, "Help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi." The map leads them to the surface of the planet, which is like how they were able to have skyscrapers hanging from the ceiling, because it turns out no one is allowed to go to the surface because they've been told that it's a dangerous wasteland and the Quintessons could still be lurking around. But they decide they have to go and get that matrix, if for no other reason than to prove themselves to Sentinel Prime. Because at this point, both Orion Pax and especially D16 buy into the propaganda that Sentinel's a big hero. And gosh, what if we, lowly miners, ended up being the ones to find the Matrix of Leadership? He would be so impressed. So Elita 1 ends up getting dragged along. They get there, they find Alpha Trion. Alpha Trion reveals the awful truth about Sentinel. And, he basically upgrades them so they're closer to their future forms. And then that's when the true plot of the movie starts of, we have to stop Sentinel. For me, the movie really picks up once they get to the surface. I mean, it was pretty decent before that, but like I said, this is a very familiar story. Irresponsible friend, responsible friend, getting into shenanigans, wanting to prove themselves to be one of the greats, trying to impress their hero. The characters are very familiar. Bumblebee, or B, as they call him, is like a type of character that we've seen in many kids' films. This type of character was all the rage in kids' films that came out in the 2000s. Like, the comic relief who never shuts up. We saw it in Shrek, we saw it in Brother Bear, we saw it in Ice Age. Tons and tons of movies made in the 2000s had this character who's the loser everybody just kind of rolls their eyes and tolerates, who never stops talking. In a way, it's kind of poetic, since Bumblebee has been through the ringer in the movies, constantly having his voice repaired and then ripped out again. All throughout the Bay movies, it's like, oh, you can talk. Just kidding, you can't. Just kidding, you can. Just kidding, you can't. Don't talk ever. Just kidding, you can. Nope. So having a movie where he's talking the whole time is actually, kind of funny in a meta way. There's also Elita 1, who is the very sharp, no nonsense, don't touch me, very vitrolic female character, which again, we've seen a lot in movies before. So it was, I was following along, I was enjoying it, but when I got to the surface, that's when the movie gets its real teeth, and it gets to the real drama. In a way, that's also kind of like Prince of Egypt, as the comedy in the first act of Prince of Egypt wasn't really the strongest, but once it gets to the drama sucks you in, and the surface is really visually interesting. Like I said, there's wild animals, robot animals, and grass, and when they meet Alpha Trion, basically he's been lying on the ground in stasis in the spot where the other primes were felled. And when they activate him, is a lot of creaking sounds as he slowly rumbles to life. It kind of reminds me a little bit of Shadow of the Colossus, especially the way that he's been lying so long that moss is visibly growing on him. And when we actually see Alpha Trion fight, which I don't think we see very often in other shows, it kicks ass. All of the fights in this movie kick ass. I mean, they're really well choreographed. They're exciting. They implement the anatomy of the Transformers really well and how their parts can shift around, and they can get pretty brutal. I think this is supposed to be a kid's movie, but it's got teeth to it. The fight scenes are maybe not as brutal as what you'd see in Michael Bay. There isn't a bunch of fluid coming out of them when they lose limbs and stuff the way that it would in Michael Bay film, but even though they take a step back in terms of how graphic the violence is, it still feels very intense just because of the direction and the way scenes are shot. There are a couple moments when I was watching this, I'm like, ooh, can you show that? Even though there's no blood and these are robots, it's still very obvious, these people are fighting to the death. As an aside, the Quintessons aren't a huge player in this movie. They're not directly involved in the main conflict, which is between Orion, D16, and Sentinel Prime, but you do see them, and they do have this really compelling sense of menace to them. When the first Quintesson ship goes by over the surface, it's these definitely seem like guys you don't want to fuck with. It's really scary, intense. They're don't even have the resources to fight against the ship. They just have to hide from it. The design of the Quintessons themselves are a little disappointing. I understand they can't go with the G1 thing with just the egg with the faces that rotate, because that looks kind of silly. But I was expecting at least a little bit of face rotation, and we didn't see any, so I'm a little disappointed. But they do at least look pretty different. They do look very alien compared to the Transformers, who are already alien. So at least it's clear at a glance, that's a Quintesson, that's a Transformer. Basically, after Alpha Trion tells them the awful truth, gives them nuke T-Cogs, they basically have to go back down to the surface, and this is where the main conflict between Orion and D16 springs up. And while they conflicted before about D16 thinking it's smarter for Orion to keep his head down, and Orion saying, now we need to rise up and prove that we're better than we are, suddenly it kind of gets flipped. it turns out D16 takes Sentinel Prime, the betrayal and reveal of who he really is, a lot harder than Orion Pax, probably because he believed in him more and he believed in following the rules and thought that, well, life is hard, but it's okay as long as I keep doing the right thing. And when that is shattered, it's shattered hard. Like I said, in the first act, it's kind of hard to believe that these characters will become who they become. But then when Orion Pax, and D16 are arguing over how to best deal with Sentinel Prime, Orion basically wants to take the evidence that Alpha Trion gave them that Sentinel Prime is a liar back down to Cybertron and reveal him. D16 doesn't think that that's good enough, or he doesn't see the point. Orion Pax basically asks him, like, don't you want to stop Sentinel Prime? And D16 responds, I don't want to stop him, I want to kill him! And he says it, really intense, and basically goes on this long rant about how he wants to make him suffer for what he did. And Orion Pax, B, and Alita 1 are looking at him like, in a way, it does, again, bring to mind Star Wars, like Anakin's whole rant after he kills the Sand People, like, I hate them!
They're like animals, and I slaughtered them like animals. I hate them!
Let the hate flow through you. I don't want to go beat for beat through what happens in this movie because I want you to see it yourself, but I will say that not only is the drama pretty strong, the comedy is also pretty strong, which seems weird because this is sort of a tragic story. I mean, you've got Orion and D16, who, even though the writing is a little hokey and familiar at times, their friendship is believable, and they go through so much together, and they've built up all these lighthearted character traits. It turns out D16 is a fanboy, specifically of Megatronus Prime, one of the 13. The origin of the Decepticon logo is that apparently there's merch that you can buy of the 13, and Orion Pax, got him a decal of Megatronus's faceplate, which it turns out is what the Decepticon insignia is. D16 is a not subtle bit of foreshadowing, wears that on his shoulder because Orion Pax gave that to him. And you see all these lighthearted interactions, and you know that these guys are eventually going to end up on opposite sides of a brutal conflict that destroys their planet. Even though the movie does end on a somewhat triumphant note, it's shit's gonna hit the fan. And it won't even take that long. But that said, all throughout the movie, they do make jokes, and while I have pointed out how Bumblebee is familiar, a lot of his lines are really funny. And he's not the only source. There are a lot of side gags or jokes or moments where I laughed audibly, which is always good, because the comedy in Transformers movies hasn't always been the best, to put it mildly. A lot of these jokes take the form of callbacks and references to other Transformers media, which is, fitting for a 40th anniversary film. But Disney tried to do the same thing, and it fell pretty flat. In Transformers, it works. I can't explain why it worked in Transformers and why it didn't in Wish, but this movie seems like it's trying to rival the Super Mario Brothers movie for how many references it makes to previous entries in the canon. It doesn't quite hit the same amount of references the Super Mario Brothers movie made, but it tries. This movie can very quickly turn into a game of spot the cameo. There's so many cameos in this movie, and they gotta fill crowd scenes with somebody, and a lot of the minors are very, even though most of them aren't name dropped, a lot of them are very obviously Autobots, or at least characters who become Autobots later. If you look in the background and on the mining scenes, you could easily spot Sideswipe, RC, Wheeljack, Hound, and those are just the ones I can think off the top of my head. And even not among the minors, but along actual Transformers, so the higher classes, you can see familiar characters. In general, the characters in this movie have a lot of personality. Even background characters who don't have names still kind of seem like they have a lot of, they have character. This is a world that has personality, and it kind of has this light-hearted feel to it that can also get very serious when it needs to. It's a world where everybody feels awake. Characterizations that we're used to aren't always there. When our group of 4 runs into Starscream, which you knew he was going to be in this movie because you saw it in the trailer, Soundwave and Shockwave are with him, and the personalities you're used to from them are not really there. There's one point where Shockwave even gets flustered and stamps his foot, which is not something you'd expect to see from the character in any other continuity. Sentinel Prime's second in command is actually Arachnid, yes, from Transformers Prime, which is probably, before the reveal, the biggest indication of his villainy. This is like, no good guy would, like, align himself with her. But, like, even then, a lot of what made her character so memorably creepy in Prime is not there. And again, that's kind of understandable. Short in running time, not her story, not her circus, not her monkeys. So you can't, like, if you lean too much into her characterization, it kind of distracts what the main conflict is supposed to be, which is Orion, D16, Sentinel. Instead, a lot of, like, what's obviously creepy about her comes across from her design. She still has, like, all the spider legs coming out of her, and she's got, like, you see early on in her intro scene, she's got, like, one row of eyes going down each side of her head. It turns out she's got even more eyes later on in a very unexpected place. She obviously doesn't have a history with RC, and if she did, that would only take place, like, many years after this movie. As you might have noticed from the marketing in this movie, or just the cast, there's a lot of celebrities in this. And while I don't think that's necessary, I've kind of, you know, am one of the people who's kind of criticized the use of celebrities in animated roles where, like, getting voice actors probably better. None of the actors in this do a bad job. Like, Chris Hemsworth, pretty good as Orion Pax. And, like, the voices of, like, D16, Bumblebee, like, this is a character who talks a lot, so you'd want his voice to be pretty good. It's pretty good, and he's like he is likable. Like, this character could have very easily been super annoying. He's not super annoying. Also, Steve Buscemi as Starscream, perfect casting. Sadly, there isn't a ton of Starscream in the movie, but again, like with Arachnid, I feel like having him be, like, elevating him to a stronger presence would take away from the main conflict. A lot of films with, like, big ensemble casts, like the Ninjago movie, for example, that I reviewed years ago, if they, like, try to juggle too many characters, they ended up, like, having it kind of focusless. So this movie knows where to keep its focus. The arc with D16, as he goes from the keep your head down and follow the rules minor to warmonger, basically, is very believable, and it's also kind of disturbing. I will say, just in terms of criticism, that it happens pretty fast. I think this movie, like, from start to finish, takes place over the course of a few days. To see, like, D16 turn around that quickly and just embrace violence, it can be a little jarring, but when you think about it, I feel like psychologically it makes sense. This is a guy who really believed in the story that he was fed, that what he was doing was for the greater good, and that his leaders were good people who were trying their best to improve things, even if things were down. And when he sees the depth of depravity and the lies, he swings way in the other direction into basically wanting to burn it all down. He doesn't go mad with power so much. It's more rage that's fueling him. He's angry, he's hurt, and he's lashing out because of that hurt. But in lashing out, he kind of gains respect and followers very quickly. You do kind of get the sense that terrible things are coming. Like, this is a guy who will cause millions of deaths. You believe it in that moment. That someone would go from being, like, very peaceful to, like, when the moment they snap, they swing really far in the other direction. It's something that we've kind of seen before. It's something that we've seen in real life where people, like, you know, people in history, they start rebellions against their oppressors and they end up being even worse than the guys they displaced were. I mean, isn't that what Animal Farm is about? You see the building blocks as it gets there. Even though it happens fast, you're kind of willing to buy it because it's so well realized. Orion his arc is not quite there. It's a little bit harder for me to believe that he goes from, like, the troublemaking guy who even flips off a guard at one point. Darkwing at one point, kind of, again, skirting the line between what this is, like, you know, is this a kid's movie or not, to, like, you know, the gravitas and the dignity that we usually associate from Optimus Prime is, like, it's not quite as smooth. This kind of reminds me of G1 in a way, because when the G1 did their episode, that I forgot the name of, that basically covers the same plot line where Optimus gets upgraded by Alpha Trion, and Orion Pax, rather, gets upgraded by Alpha Trion and becomes, you know, Optimus Prime. His personality immediately changes once Alpha Trion gives him that upgrade. He basically steps out of a room and he's Optimus now, and he's talking like Optimus now, even though he wasn't before. It's not quite that rapid. I guess the justification is that he realizes how dire the stakes are, and he, like, you know, shapes up. You can kind of justify it of like, oh, his personality changed after he got the Matrix, because the Matrix can, you know, according to lore, it contains the wisdom of all the past primes in it. But like, his first, like, big dramatic speech that he gives to the miners who will become this future, the future Autobots, is made before he gets the Matrix, so he shouldn't have that wisdom yet. So the fact that he's able to come up with this super eloquent, moving speech on the spot is strange. It doesn't seem consistent. That said, even though the character development isn't quite as well done, I think, in Orion Pax's case, there is a clear ideological difference, at least between him and D16. Where D16 wants revenge, Orion Pax is much more of, like, justice and doing things through, like, a process. And you kind of, the movie tries to make the argument that Megatronus's, frankly, righteous anger is kind of clouding his judgment and is causing him to make impulsive decisions that maybe are compromising Cybertron's future. And honestly, the system they were part of is so corrupt, and Sentinel Prime himself is such a smug prick that, plus the thing he did is so terrible, that honestly, both in and out of universe, I could see a lot of people siding with D16. Like, no, I'm on his side, kill the bastard. But, Optimus is portrayed as the heroic one for not wanting to kill him, which is consistent to the character.
You didn't betray me. You betrayed yourself. No, Optimus!
Revenge versus justice is the thing that tears them apart, and the thing that will